a really exciting start to our 4th International Police Conference, and I would ask you to just participate as fully as you can. We would like as many questions using the chat bar as we go through, and in the room those are being monitored. What we will try and do is, by the time we get to the end of the conference, to the end of the workshop, have gathered together some themes of questions and we'll put them to the panel. And all of these will go towards our final conference workshop. So, not sure what's happening there. So this afternoon is the first of 7 workshops. This one's looking at violence against women and girls. We then move on to look at rape and serious sexual offences. We then move on to look at fraud and cybercrime, and then the final subject area is around policing public demonstrations. 3 of these workshops are being held in the UK, and then we have 4 further workshops looking at the same issues, one being held in Sweden, one in Germany, another one in another part of Germany, and a final one in India, where we will try and bring together thoughts from around the world on the same issues. And the idea is that all of these issues come together to help us build something which will go into the conference at the end of or in the beginning of September. The context for this particular piece of work is sort of set within the Police Foundation strategic review, looking at the issues that were raised through that into policing, looking specifically around trust and confidence in police and what has happened recently, both in the UK and internationally, affecting trust and confidence, and particularly affecting certain aspects of society or certain communities, and their feelings around and their experiences of the police, which have over the past few years raised a number of concerns. A lot of concern around police officer burnout and well-being. Many officers being asked to do jobs that they haven't the experience of dealing with in the past. Many of them having very high workloads, and people working in areas of quite high pressure with a lot of expectation around them. But then on top of that, we've had the performance challenges, particularly the issues around officers' performance not reaching the standards and how that impacts upon victims, how that impacts upon the criminal justice system, and how all of that affects the ethical standing, the legitimacy of the police to actually do their job. So what we wanted to do with this conference is, rather than go back through and look at what all the problems are, we wanted to look at the fact that there are a number of solutions, a number of approaches that already exist. We want to capture those together, looking at the areas that we've talked about, and then try and build some ideas of what we might be able to recommend for the police to do moving forward. So the aims of the conference are looking at developing capability of the policing system, but looking at it within existing structures. So the Police Foundation review, the strategic review, came up with a huge number of recommendations, many of which are long-term and many of which need very significant investment. What we wanted to do was to say, rather than just lose all of the energy that comes from that review and all the ideas that were in there, what can we do now to start the movement towards that journey to improve policing performance and to change the relationship between the police and the community? And the main aim is to really think about fundamentally improving performance in protective services. So how do we, as a policing community, if you like, the police and all the partners involved, make a significant step forward to improve performance? So there are lots of little objectives which we're going to look at, and these 5 themes, little objectives is probably understating them. These are actually quite huge pieces of business, but looking at how can we enhance trust and confidence in policing, what are the skills and technology that's needed to succeed, and we've got a lot of external technology partners engaging in the conference to come with some ideas about things that might be able to assist. What's the learning and development approach that works? How can we really enhance the approach that we have with police officers? Looking at improving police and public well-being, thinking about what are the things that would make both officers and the public feel happier, and to look at the role of leadership in all of this. What is it that is required from the leaders in policing to take forward these concepts? So with these workshops, which are running through July, in August we will then be looking at the outcome from the workshops, and in September we have our conference where we're presenting back, and we will particularly be looking at themes that cut across the various different areas. So what is it, not only can we learn from the research around the response to rape and serious sexual offences, which will improve performance in that area, but what can we take from that which might actually affect policing performance more widely? What's the learning that we could take out of that which could be implemented? And then our intention is that next year we have a conference where we come back and look at all of this and see what the outcomes are. It's not just a straightforward us presenting conference. We want some things from you, engagement. The first one is to ask questions, so use the chat bar to ask questions as we go through. Paul, who's sitting at the other end of the room from me, will be monitoring that. I'll be trying to pull those together in themes, and at the end we'll have a chance where the panel will look at those themes. The other thing that we're really looking for is examples of practice that people think are worth exploring, whether there's evidence base to show that these things are working, or these are projects which you're engaged with which you think have value to look at. If you could email those to us or put them in the chat bar, links to things on the website, we will try and pull all of that together, and that will come as part of the presentation for the main conference. So that's the sort of background to today's workshop. And what I'm going to do now is hand over to Parm Sandhu, who is going to chair this afternoon. Thank you ever so much for joining in today. And as I said just there, what we really want is feedback from you as you go through. So if you feel the need to give a thumbs up or a clap emoji as you go through, please feel free to do so that the speakers know that what you're doing is enjoyable. So Parm, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us today. An absolute pleasure to be on this panel. I'm going to introduce you just very briefly to the members of the panel. We have Betsy Stanco, Professor Betsy Stanco, who is a world leading academic who's going to introduce herself properly when she speaks, and you should have read her bio because it's worth reading. We've also got the strategic lead for MOPAC, Lizzie Peters. Again, I'm absolutely privileged to be on this panel. And I can't miss out Polly Hurrah, who is a founder of a charity and a women's refuge that not only helps right across the country, but has a reach internationally as well. So I'm with three wonderful women here who can answer questions at the end of the presentations. So although we'd ask for you to put the questions through on the chat bar now, they will be answered at the end of our presentation. If for any reason we don't get to your question, don't despair, because those questions will be published on our website afterwards, so you will have the ability to see what those answers were. So I'm going to just lead on to my actual presentation before I hand over to Betsy and Lizzie for their parts. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the actual report that came out from the National Police Chiefs Council and also from the College of Policing, and that the catalyst for this report is the events that happened in 2020 and 2021. Most of us will have read the awful tragic stories in June 2020 of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry. But then in March 2021, the horrific rape and murder of Sarah Everard, followed a little while later by the murder of Sabina Nasser. Now, there have been, that's just, three instances that we can talk about, and there have been many others that don't make it onto the media. those three individuals, or three cases I should say, were the catalyst for the demand for change, and that's where this report has come through. The actual police framework was launched in December 2021, and it's requiring every police force to make changes. But this isn't just a report that cuts across into police forces. This is trying to bring together the charities, the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office, and actually get everyone to work together to get those outcomes that are needed. The report has got clear timelines and clear objectives. Now, some of the actions that are being discussed and implemented, and we'll just move on to the next slide, are about behaviours, and this is a societal issue. This is about behaviours that are misogynistic, sexist and sexualised. So it's not just talking about calling out those behaviours, it's also talking about creating a safe environment so that women who are strong enough, brave enough, and have got the support around them, well, not just women, are more likely to call out that behaviour. But then what happens afterwards? What happens to that woman in that environment, in either a work environment or home environment, and where's the support for that person? The report does talk about increased activity to capture individuals who are perpetrating these sorts of crimes, and there are some logistical data issues that are involved in this. I'm going to move on to the data principles. What we found, I was a police officer for 30 years, and what we found is that data isn't being collected. Where it is being collected, it's not accessible and it's not in the right format. It's not being used to identify either gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity. And this report does actually specify what data should be recorded and how accessible it should be and how it should be used. And again, it talks about that data cutting right across the Home Office and other areas of business wherever data may be collected. That could be the prison service as well. So everyone should be considering how they're collecting that data and how it's available for others. There are outcomes and a performance timeline, and the report itself is well worth reading. We've put it on our website so that it's easily accessible, but it is really easy to find. Now, in April 2022, the Outcomes and Performance Framework was published, but before anything further can happen, before meaningful data, meaningful reports can be attributed to the activity outlined in this report, there has to be a baseline set. And for that baseline to be identified as quickly as possible so that by March next year, a meaningful report and data can be shared. Those reports and the information that is gathered are going to be public facing so that they can be shared with the charities, they can be shared with the third sector, as well as the criminal justice systems. When the reports are published, there will be an opportunity to consult further with government, policing, the violence against women and girls sector, and other experts, because I think one of the most important things about this report is that there is a plan to actually make it better and make those changes. And a lot of this is about the communication side of it, where people haven't been communicating, they haven't had the right data, and there hasn't been that sharing of information as well. So going back to the report, there are clear objectives. The first one, building trust and confidence, and perpetrator pursuit and safer spaces. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but before I do, when we talk about building trust and confidence, this isn't just about women. This does cross right across violent crime, crosses across all sorts of aspects of policing. So when we get it right for the VAUG agenda, we'll get it right for everybody. Anybody who's a victim will benefit from the activities in this report. So moving on to, it's been divided up into pillars, and moving on to the pillars and the trust and confidence, it's how often are complaints made? And they could be about police officers, they could be about members of the public. How quickly are they dealt with? What are the timelines? what activity takes place, and also what's the attrition rate? How many individuals actually get to court, and why is there an attrition rate? So all of that data needs to be examined, and the causes need to be dealt with so that we can have meaningful information going forward. On the next part is Pillar 2, which is about pursuing the most harmful individuals who perpetrate the VAWG offences. But again, it's about what is being reported, how quickly is it being dealt with, and what are the outcomes. But one of the parts of this is how many outstanding victims of VAWG are on the books at any one time? What activity takes place to reduce that number? Because we've all heard recently about warrants and about people walking the streets who are wanted, but what's the activity and who's driving that activity, and what are the performance indicators for that? One of the adages for me as when I was a police officer was, if it's measured, it gets done. So what are the measurements that are being used to actually catch these individuals? And we don't want headlines, we want the activity behind those headlines. And then moving on to the final pillar, which is Pillar 3. How is violence against women and girls reflected in policing control strategies, in the Police and Crime Commissioners' plans, and in community safety partnership plans? How often is it in there, and what are the measurements again? What work is actually being taken for identification of online offences in private and public spaces in policing? What's the activity? That has to be identified, and for solutions to be identified to deal with those issues. And how effectively does policing deliver a problem-solving response to the riskiest places? Do we actually ask women and girls? Do we ask our communities? How often do we ask and then actually listen and take actions based on that? And this is about, and I'll go back to the communication side of it. Communication is a big key to the violence against women and girls agenda, because without that communication, without that listening, it's not going to change. I have covered the actual report very, very quickly because of the time constraints today. I'm really happy to take questions, and we are going to publish all of this on our website afterwards. So when we come to the questions, I will look forward to getting some questions around the actual report itself. But again, I would just point out, this is about trust and confidence. This is about having the ability to report, and then what happens after those reports are made. So just a reminder, use the chat bar to ask questions. And if you have any examples of good practice of how violence against women and girls is being dealt with, either in your area, you may be a police officer, you may be a social worker, whatever walk of life you're in, how is it being dealt with? And also there's an email address there that you can actually send forward those good practice ideas. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Betsy Stanko and Lizzie Peters. Thank you all very much.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Betsy Stanko and this is Lizzie Peters. What we'd like to do today is to give you a live example of very active change and transformation in the policing and investigation of rape and sexual assault. This is a taster of Operation Soteria Bluestone that has been running since January of 2021. And we have to date completed 4 deep dives with our police services. We are currently in 1 more, and I'll tell you a lot about the particular approach, some of the initial findings, and the plans for the next phases of this work, which will continue from September for at least another year. So I'll turn over to Lizzie just to introduce herself, and then I'll talk then. Thanks.
Hello, good afternoon. It's really nice to be here, and thank you to the London Policing College for inviting us to speak and joining this workshop. I'm Head of Programme Management on Operation Soteria Bluestone, based at the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime in London, with a small team there. Just a quick bit about me before Betsy introduces herself and the programme in lots of detail. So I suppose what's crucial about the role at MOPAC and the work of MOPAC is that this is the third of 3 collaborative programmes that have been designed and delivered, hosted by the organisation and funded by the Home Office. What this has enabled us to do is build that collaborative working between academia and policing, broadly across policing, to really build the evidence base and gain the insight to deliver transformational change. I have to say this programme is definitely quite a lot larger and more high profile than the previous 2, but I think what's really important is that it's built on about 6 years of learning of how to deliver effective transformation. Before working in MOPAC, I worked for the Met Police as their head of partnerships for a number of years, and in their programmes team. Before that, I worked for an organisation which some people may remember called Crime Concern. We did a lot of work setting up community safety reduction partnerships and youth offending teams. So a lot of, I suppose, broad experience across the criminal justice system. And before that, I worked as a probation officer. So what you've got in the Soteria Bluestone team, I suppose, is a breadth of experience across policing and the wider CJS, as well as lots of programme and learning and development experience. Back to Betsy.
Great. So what we've done with these 3 programs is we've reconfigured the collaboration with academics in a different way. Part of this comes from my own experience of working on the inside of government and the police over the last 20 years. And it was, for me, quite important that we recalibrated the relationship between academics and the police service. Because in many ways, they were still often in their own camps, in their own worlds, so to speak. And how you come together to actually create something that police officers, because this is the point of the work, it's police officers' practice that changes in a very, very different way, so that they, not only that they feel confident in what you do, you feel confident in what you do. And that's really important. That's a primary contributor to your well-being, but it's also a primary contributor to better service to victims. So just to give you a little flavor of where we are in the current context. The latest data from the National Office of National Statistics suggests that for England and Wales, 895,782 offences were flagged as domestic in the most recent data. This represents a 7% increase from the previous year and a 20% increase pre-corona. Now that's important, from March 19. So what we have is, prior to corona, there was an increase in reports. Since then, it's gone up, way up. So if you're feeling the heat, it's real. Sexual offenses recorded by police are at their highest level ever, recorded within the last 12 months, 22% increase from the same period in 2021. Of these, 37% were rape offenses. 67,125 rape offenses were recorded, a 20% increase on the previous year. Again, if you're feeling the heat, it's real. Just a taster. In the most recent quarter recorded by the CPS, the number of rape prosecutions is 661. The number of suspects charged is 550. So this project started as part of the government's rape review. On the backs of an apology by the current Prime Minister to say that actually the service to women and men who are sexually abused in this country is just not good enough. And that was a public apology. I was involved in the kind of work around rape and sexual abuse. I have to say, I'll just give you a little taster of who I am and where I'm coming from. Aside from the American accent, I do hold a British passport. So what I'm bringing to Operation Soteria is 40 years of working with police and prosecutors, not only in the UK, but in the United States and around the world. 30 years plus as an academic, studying violence against women, in particular in the years when the term didn't even exist in academics. I am a founding member of the Feminist Criminology branch of the American Society of Criminology. I founded a refuge for battered women in 1978, again, one of the earliest in the United States. This refuge still exists in Worcester, Massachusetts. I've worked for 15 years inside the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime as head of analytics and insight and evidence. I bring a great deal of frustration about the blah, blah, blah of no change over years, and those numbers that I suggested to you earlier, the real numbers, the published data. Despite 3 decades of inspections in this country, Home Office reports, third sector reports, commissioned inquiries, such as the Stern Report or the Angelini Report, and so forth, there has been a worsening of the impact of the way in which investigations or investigations somehow fail. And prosecutions are, there are a dearth of prosecutions. Speak specifically about the CPS. There is another project looking at, well, part of this project looking at them. We're not involved in that. We're working very carefully and closely with them. But I want to specifically talk about policing, your practice, the need for better practice, and the kinds of help and guidance that we will be producing and working with you in order to improve that in the shortest time possible, because that's the other thing. We're in a crisis now. We don't have years to wait. I'm not interested in a public inquiry. I'm interested in change. This work sits on 4 decades of activism by the feminist communities, which has often been over those 4 decades on the fringes of government. To me, the most interesting thing is that this project is actually being funded by government, and I'm involved in it. It is the kinds of concerns about it that activists have put on the table for decades is now slowly seeping into questions and challenges around confidence and trust, and we heard a little bit about that earlier. But also, we need to think about this work now in terms of a recalibration of what we want justice to be for us, for safeguarding, for public safety, and for the physical and mental health of this nation, because we know a lot about the impact of sexual abuse. We know that it affects mental health. We know that it fragments families. We know that that the legacies are carried with people, women and men, throughout their entire lives. And it's important to take that seriously. Work in this area is work to improve the whole of who we are and what we want. My work stands on the kind of intimate knowledge that I've grown over these years, the scholarly study of policing itself, riding in the backs of streetcars in the 70s in New York. Yeah, welcome to my world. An understanding and a really keen understanding of police culture. No flies on me and no flies on anybody who thinks that they can challenge my understanding of who police are and what they stand for. I believe that we need policing, and I believe that we need good policing, and that's why I've stayed in this area for as long as I have. So what Operation Soteria does is it integrates academic insight in a new way, I think, in a new way for me. And if it's new for me, then you can teach old dogs new tricks. And so in short, we are embedding an insightful evidence base into the current state of as is, and the policing of violence against women and children. The work we're doing on rape has resonance across. So just a quick taster of what it is, and I'm going to give you some findings, and Lizzie's going to talk to you about one of the most important components that we've got, which is the learning and development component as well. So this is funded by the Home Office. We've started in, I said, January of 2021 with the work we've done with Avon and Somerset in particular. You may have heard about Avon and Somerset's great work. That Pathfinder work began in the spring of 2021. We have been commissioned by the Home Office to create a national operating model for the investigation of rape and serious assault. Interestingly enough, there are not a lot of templates out there for this. I'll just let that float for a bit. And so we've already, as you say, the police forces are there. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, when I say it comes from academic insight and the literature, as well as our work within police, just to give you an understanding, I conducted the first 8 of the 9 rape reviews that were in the Metropolitan Police, the 2019 rape review, which was published as the recent follow-up in terms of that early work using the methodology. Also found that things were getting worse. So after, in 2019, when that report was published, I and Lizzie and Robin and Catherine, who are all involved in this project, sort of were peeled off the ceiling, and we said we have to do something different. How can we do this differently without calling for yet another inquiry and without calling for yet another more training? Because it's not just more training. You can and it is about organizational change that enables you to do your job better. Because actually there's quite a lot of undermining of the work that is happening by demand, by skills and capabilities, and by the kinds of other activities that are going on in policing that take you away from some of the important work that this really is. So we created an approach which both shapes the inquiry and the solutions that we're coming up with. It is one which absolutely at its heart is about organizational and transformational change. There's no way we can tinker with what's happening right now. It's just impossible to tinker. There are some major alignments that need to happen. I can say in doing this work, it is collaborative. So when I describe the pillars, each of those pillars are not only led by an academic and with academic teams doing the inquiry and the analysis, but they're having an ongoing dialogue with an officer, at least one, if not more, in each of the pillars, who are actually working with the academics to try to create an understanding of what's actually happening in their own police service. Can we find a way of actually aligning these pillars? We are suggesting that once aligned with these 6 pillars, there's traction. Because at the moment, we're not getting any traction. We seem to be going backwards. So it's the traction that's important. So we're using 6 pillars for traction. Surprise, surprise, a suspect-focused investigation. Well, we did in every single police service found to a lesser extent, but we found that actually investigations were largely victim credibility units. That actually the investigation starts with a victim, but often ends with a victim. So you don't even get to the suspect. Well, that's an issue. That's a problem, actually. Because when we talk about repeat suspects, our data suggests between 25 and 40% of the named suspects in your police service, or at least the police services we have worked with so far, are repeats. I'll say that again. That means the names of the rapists, possible offenders, suspects, we can't call them rapists yet because they haven't gone to court, are already in your system. And by the way, in the Avon and Somerset data, we found that 60% of the named offenders also had other involvement with police. So you actually know something about them. Important. Procedural justice for victims. Now, this is the interesting thing. Procedural justice is the core of trust and confidence. We keep talking about trust and confidence, but the mechanism, the mode, the delivery agent is procedural justice. Because if people feel like they've been listened to, respected, treated fairly, regardless of the outcome, frankly, they feel that they actually got what they needed from the system. Now, what we're also saying is, in your own data, there are seeds for actually doing much more than just being nice to victims and communicating with them well. You're actually going to start disrupting and arresting suspects, which is not happening in any great numbers, as the data I suggested and showed you earlier demonstrates. Okay, pillar 4 and is about learning, development, and particularly well-being. Very, very important that these things are all integrated together, because you don't feel good about your job if you don't know what you're doing. And we have many, many, many officers across the country who are in situations of having to make key decisions in stressful situations where they don't feel, and I will say they do not have, the right skills and capabilities to do so, and they're not backed up by the kinds of learning and development that is offered to them in their police service. And we'll talk about that at length in a bit. The 5th pillar is about data and performance, and we talked a little bit about that earlier in terms of why is data so important? Well, it's not because it's data. It's actually your own information and intelligence. But to understand what that intelligence is telling you about the strategic problem, because if you understand the strategic problem, you can think differently about investigation, because that enables you to actually plan much more efficiently, I would suggest, your route of inquiry. And that's why data and performance are really important, because that's a way of looping back to think, are we actually asking the right questions in the kinds of investigations that we're doing in order to enable more cases to go forward. And the final one, the final pillar, is about digital forensics. And that one was added after we began. It was because, again, I'm an old dog, or actually an old cat, but digital forensics is really key. The digital world is so key to the rape and sexual assault arena. Digital is now integral to our lives, and in many ways, some of the outrage, rightly so, of the third sector was about the way in which victims' phones were being taken, seized, as they said, to interrogate whether or not those victims were telling the truth. Okay, next slide, please. Right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I could if I was in an academic setting, but I won't. Just say we got a shed load of data, and it's probably the most data that anybody's ever had on this subject anywhere in the world. But we'll just go on for that. Next slide, please. Okay, and I think I've said that, so whack. Next one. The one thing I will say is that because this is a collaboration between the police officers in each force and the academics, is we run a no surprise policy. That is, we're continuously feeding back what we're finding. And when we're talking about that, what it means, what kind of change, who are the change agents in your force? What are the kinds of opportunities you have to do that, to do change? And what are the kinds of things that you need? And again, when we get to Lizzie talking about learning and development, that's a really key feature, because we've found that as the linchpin, the Achilles heel of the success of this program. But I'll give you a taster before we get there, and that is what are the key high-level findings, which I think are beginning to challenge some of the both government, third sector, and police narratives about this arena. One is we are advocating specialists and specialisms. That doesn't mean specialist units. That means knowledge. It means that you actually have the right knowledge to make and to think and to make decisions, and the right kind of support. So what we have found is, and you would not be surprised because you're living in your world, not much good use of advanced practitioners, learned people in your organization who actually have some good knowledge, inexperienced supervisors, inexperienced investigators, and without a proper approach, a good strategic approach to analyzing how learning is an integral part of good policing, we have found is lacking. The second, which actually surprised Home Office officials, is the overlap between domestic abuse and rape and sexual offenses. Now, that would not surprise any of you. Those of you who work in the DA sector, you would say, of course we knew that. And some of you working in the RASO sector would say, yes, we knew that. Well, let me tell you, neither the twain shall meet in most police services. You got DA over here and RASO over here, and sometimes a little bit of a conversation or fight about who's going to take which case because of the overlap, or nobody takes it. What that means is that the investigative strategies, which are not about stranger rape, rare as it is, 5%, by the way, of the recorded crimes that we looked at, 5% of over 80,000 reported rape and other sexual offenses. So 95% of what is reported are suspects and victims who have some knowledge of each other, including those who only met 24 hours ago. And we can talk about that because we know what the outcome is and the difference between stranger and not. But the overlap really needs to be discussed much, much further in government, with the third sector, and also in terms of resourcing. Where are there any efficiencies, for example, in being able to think differently about how that work is done in a way that enables you to stack repeat offending, particularly in the DA sector, and make sure that there actually is a collaborative way of not just investigating one-to-one report, but clusters of reports. We actually have a law now that's called coercive control. Just reminding you, very underutilized, and we are going to bring in a legal expert to help us develop in a more coherent way some legal narratives that will help you with investigations in 1/3 of your cases. And then finally, another outcome is the differential outcomes, which I mentioned earlier. That it does depend on the relationship between the victim and the suspect. You would know that, but actually the interesting one, which I think if we go to the next slide, yeah, so this is the DA information. So again, 1/3 of the cases. I'll have the next slide, please. The interesting thing about suspect victim relationships is that, not surprisingly, we have something called stranger ones, which is complete strangers. Somebody jumps out of a bush and has no idea who it is that he's jumping on. More likely to be charged. Again, it wouldn't surprise you. It would surprise you if you realize that in one police force, this was 8.2% of stranger rapes. But to me, the most interesting thing in terms of thinking about outcomes is that next one, which is called Stranger 2, somebody you'd never seen before, a Tinder date, a masseuse who comes to your house, somebody you don't know at all, but you will be considered to have known if you met them online or in a bar or whatever, even though you might not have any idea who the person is. You can see how the charge rate drops dramatically, over half, just by chance meeting somebody over 24 hours. So that we're going to use that data and those spaces to begin to open up the dialogue around, well, what are the assumptions behind meeting somebody on Tinder? Does that really mean that, because I have to say there are many examples where no evidence ends up being produced in a way that enables an investigation to move a case from no charge to charge. Right, so I'm gonna, I think at this point, just give you a little bit of a breather from me. Let Lizzie talk about the kind of learning and development that's on Opsteria,
Okay.
I'll come back with more findings.
So I suppose, as you've heard Betsy say already, we came into the programme absolutely clear that learning and development of officers and staff was crucial to, I suppose, not only to any transformational change in policing or indeed other organisations, but especially in this area. We knew this, I suppose, because of the previous programmes that we'd done, both of which had focused on learning and development, which had really highlighted, I suppose, how crucial learning and development were for the transformation not only of individual capability and practice, but therefore of organisational capability and practice, and ultimately, therefore, the route to delivering improved outcomes, which is what we're looking for: improved charge rates, improved conviction rates. I suppose what was also really clear to us, and I think we emphasise this point regularly, when we talk about learning and development and that being crucial, we're not talking about training. We're not talking about spending 2 days or a week on a training programme online or in a classroom and then going back to your normal way of working. We're talking about building learning and development into into the ways of working, into the workplace through ways of integrating knowledge into practice through reflection and so on. So this will all be explored in more detail and be part of the work we develop as we build the national operating model towards the end of the programme. But I think it's really important to say we're not talking about training, we're talking about really good quality learning and development. We know that's integral to delivering the change that we want to see. I suppose what we also knew when we came into the programme, again from previous learning, was that currently, and certainly for some time, policing learning and development has been up to scratch, I think it's fair to say, has not had the capability, has not had the capacity, and has not had the development or support within policing organisations to deliver what officers and staff need to do their jobs effectively. I suppose so. We certainly knew that from our previous work, which had focused on supporting forces to transform their learning and development. We know that transformation potentially has started, but hasn't got very far down the road, I think it's fair to say. And all of our, I suppose, preconceptions, all of our thinking about police learning and development, I think has been confirmed so far by the research Betsy talked about in the first 5 forces we've worked with as part of Operation Soteria Bluestone. I suppose some of the reasons for the lack of quality of L&D that we need to see in policing, we know it's not necessarily valued as part of the culture sometimes. We know that there has been a considerable lack of resourcing in this area, particularly enhanced through austerity. And we know that some of the mechanisms for driving L&D within policing need further development. I suppose one of the things we found was in the research we did, really quite a significant gap between what the College of Policing's ambitions are for delivering L&D for policing and actually what's being delivered on the ground in forces and the impact that has. So what did we do? What did we want to do about it? So right from the start of the programme, we have been really clear that rather than having academics beavering away in ivory towers, producing reports, we have wanted to pull the learning almost hot off the press and share that with policing. And the way we wanted to do that was through setting up a national learning network, a really innovative way of sharing learning and transferring knowledge across policing. And I'll talk in a minute a bit about some of the ways we've done that. I think it's important to say this is a model we developed as part of a previous programme, and I think this time, which was initially used by the National Police Chiefs Council portfolio on learning and development. So there is a Learning and Development National Learning Network, and now there is also a RASO National Learning Network in policing. So the concept really of this network is that it is open to all policing practitioners and leaders across all the 43 forces and the other ones, the other non-Home Office forces. It's also open to key stakeholders who are interested in this work. So it's open to College of Policing, Crown Prosecution Service, colleagues. It's open to people working in government, and it's also increasingly open to the third sector as well. And the idea of this is that we share learning out from the programme to the forces, and we also enable that interface and discussion about the research, and as well as bringing in learning from evidence-based learning from other parts of the criminal justice system as relevant to this particular group of practitioners. So we've run significant numbers of webinars, masterclasses, and events where we've shared the research findings. I think our most successful webinars have been masterclasses hosted by Dr. Patrick Tidmarsh, who has really brought a hugely, I suppose, insightful and reflective and innovative way of looking at investigation called The Whole Story. Patrick has run a series of 5 masterclasses for us, one of which had over 900 attendees, at which point we thought our team's infrastructure was going to collapse. But those webinars are actually available to all policing practitioners on the Knowledge Hub. So all of that has been recorded and is available. So these are the ways we're wanting to build knowledge, share knowledge, and continue to transfer that evidence-based knowledge across policing. As I mentioned, we've including all of our products, all of the learning and findings on the Knowledge Hub. It's all accessible. It's even quite well organised. So again, I would recommend people who have access to go in and look at that. And crucially as well, we're building, and we've built a number of peer-to-peer networks, recognising that those relationships between forces and that opportunity for providing support, action learning, reflective learning, experience from practice are absolutely crucial to understanding this knowledge and to embedding this knowledge. So, for example, in the 5 forces that Betsy talked about that we've been working with so far, all of the RASO leads in those forces meet on a regular basis and discuss their experience of the programme and discuss their experience of implementing change. And likewise, all of their colleagues working on pillars 1 to 6 and so on. We've also set up a network across the police and crime commissioners to enable them to really consider and evolve their oversight role. Those networks will be continuing into year 2 and will be developed further. So that's what we came in to set up, and that's what we have been delivering. I suppose whilst we were conducting the research in the first sort of 2 or 3 forces, I suppose we found very concerningly that there was a lack of, I suppose, learning opportunity and lack of capability in some of the officers delivering rape and serious sexual offence investigations. Concerningly so, that we found some officers in some forces that had no learning and development or training at all, and were coming at this in their response role. So this for us was a huge concern, and we, since October last year, have been working with the College of Policing jointly to infuse, I suppose, and to transfer the knowledge from the Soteria Bluestone programme into the way the college designs their programmes. We started with an interim programme, which is now called the RASO Investigative Skills Learning Programme. That has been launched by the college in mid-June and is currently being piloted in 3 forces. Dr. Patrick Tidmarsh is very much involved in this, bringing his insight and evidence-based approach to investigation into the heart of the way police officers are trained to investigate, building on and in some cases, I think, replacing the more procedural and process-focused training that had been there previously. We know that we're all proud of producing that, and that training, that learning programme will be available to more forces from September and then ongoing to all police forces. But that's only the start, I think, in terms of policing L&D regarding rape and serious sexual offences. We know that bringing that new way of working, bringing the evidence base and insight and knowledge into the heart of policing L&D is going to be absolutely crucial to this transformation. And so I suppose with that in mind, year 2 of our research, which will be starting from September, has a really strong, well-resourced pillar 4, the pillar looking at learning, development and well-being. And we will be doing extensive work really to review the end-to-end design and delivery of L&D around RASO over the coming year, to get to a point, I think, where we feel we are on stronger ground and certainly moving in the right direction to see that transformation and capability that we know needs to underpin the change that we want to see. Betsy, I may have missed some pieces out there, but I'll let you pick up anything that I have.
Okay. So thanks, Lizzie. I'll have the next slide, please. Because what I want to do now is show you some of the high-level findings from the research. And now you'll understand why we think learning and development is so critical and crucial to taking this forward. This is information that has been fed back to each of the 4 out of the 5 police forces. All of the 4 out of 5 police forces have accepted our findings. So this is not information that's in any way disputed by the police service itself. So what we found indeed is what undermines the competence and what begins to explain the appalling state of as is that we learned that actually the knowledge about the academic evidence of sexual offending is missing from the police information. So in order to think about how you would want to investigate or approach an investigation, for example, a sexual exploitation case, words, by the way, that we didn't even use 10 years ago, but now we understand sexual exploitation in a different kind of way, but we tend to only seem to use an approach about sexual exploitation if the victims happen to be young. That's not the case. It doesn't matter what age you are. Sexual exploitation is understanding in terms of the way in which offenders groom and basically prepare victims. I'll use that word in quotes. So an understanding of sexual offending is really essential if you're going to investigate rape and sexual assault, because 5% of the cases people think is consent. Exploitation is not consent. So what there was, and what we found in every police service, was an overemphasis on victim credibility. And essentially, the lack of learning and development led to a deprofessionalization of competent investigators. As I said, under-identification of repeat perpetrators, missed opportunities in terms of investigation of suspects, and very inconsistent quality of victim engagement. Next slide, please. Now, again, what we found was that organizations completely undervalued this work. Complex investigations need time and resourcing. We found some shocking and unrealistic caseloads under resourcing. We found officers desperately trying to manage caseloads and actually to the detriment of their own well-being, particularly officer burnout and empathy fatigue toward victims. So we're not blaming this issue on police officers, particular individuals. What we're finding is the context within which you are working is unsubstantially, it's just not acceptable in my view, and in the research that we've completed. But also it was unsupported, as Lizzie said, by forced learning and development to provide you with the right skills and understanding to do the job. And the next slide, please. And finally, what we did find, and if you were all feeling exhausted at this point, you actually, the surveys that we have done of you have showed us that your exhaustion levels are exceeding those of medics under COVID. You're exhausted, you're stressed, and for that, I'm sorry. Because it's actually your well-being is critical to the core of good service. It's just absolutely core. And we know, I mean, we're finding, I think, really quite worrying. I've described it as a crisis in the well-being of officers who are working in this arena. Next slide. Okay, so in some ways, what we are trying to do is very practical. That is, make your life, make victims' lives better, because we know that sexual assault and sexual abuse is so prevalent that actually the number that are there are increasingly numbers of cases being reported to the police, but not because, well, we don't know whether or not there's an increase in sexual offending, but what we do know is many cases are not reported. The important thing is what we're doing here is trying to get our house in order, trying to do better. And actually what this project does is enable us to have a systematic way of doing so, putting stakes in the ground, tethering those stakes to knowledge and knowledge base. It's about, it really is, for me, I'm not and have never been a warranted police officer. I have worked with police officers since the mid-70s. And actually, the dominance of legislation in process and procedure it just trumps everything else. So if you try to do learning and development, you end up having to learn the legislation as opposed to what is it about what happened that's relevant to try to figure out what you do about it and how it is that this engages with a justice outcome. So we also know that we are really going in with very different view, irreverent views to some extent of the traditional and old stay approach to learning. It's different. We must have reflective practice. We must enable officers who are actually, some of whom are highly skilled and really good at this, but still meeting new dilemmas and new issues. Next slide, please. Officer well-being has been at the heart of this work since the beginning, and that in many ways has been quite appreciated in the way in which we take this work forward. But we also know that the kind of ability to support you out there is just still not good enough. Occupational health isn't going to really make your workloads any less. So we do need to think about the context within which you're working and how we can manage caseloads in a different way, which is why the overlap between domestic and sexual abuse reports might give us some leeway, some wiggle room to begin to at least start without having to increase financial resources. And I'll let that float for a minute because we'll get back to that, and we'll be thinking about throughout this whole next year. And finally, technology, data, and data science really somehow seems to have lost the police service, just passed you by somehow. It's really important to know what your data tells you, what your information tells you. This is one of the biggest commodities that exists in the world right now, data and understanding your clients. It's time that police service, we harness that data and that understanding in a very different way for the impact and benefit of victims. So I'm going to stop at that point. We've talked for far longer than we should have, and we'll turn it over to you and the panel and the questions.
Right, thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Lizzie. Right, I'm going to just convene the panel. So, Polly, could I ask you to join the panel? And before we start taking questions, could I just ask that you give a short introduction to yourself, please, Polly, as you join the main panel? Might move the camera back. Okay. Right, so if you just join the panel and I'll tilt it.
We're very cozy and it's a bit warm in here, but we'll be fine. Excellent.
Right, Paul, do you have any questions for the panel?
Yes, I've split the questions into a couple of categories really that they tend to cover. So the first would be around research. First question is, how have the HMRC been involved or engaged in this research? Generally, they compare capabilities and effectiveness but do they take academic research into account?
Certainly, we had a number of discussions with HMIC while they were doing their joint inspections. And if you an inspection, Operation Soteria is mentioned as a good way forward, a new, interesting way of engaging academics in inquiry in a different kind of way. Maybe HMI might learn from this.
Okay, next question is, within the research, are you looking at best practice from overseas forces to inform what you're doing?
At the moment, we have not done an international troll of police services. In terms of best practice, I'd be more than happy to hear best practice backed up by evidence and research as well. I'm sure there's lots of good practice that we're picking up. What we're already, I'm not saying everything is not good practice, but what is important is we cannot guarantee any consistency across the board for any victim who reports today, tomorrow, and the next day. So there is no consistency. What we're trying to do is actually move toward consistency through an evidence way. We will, and we are, looking at the outcomes. These are being monitored by the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office right now as we speak. The outcomes of our work inside a police service. What are they doing differently? How are they doing it differently? We'll be collecting that information in a bigger way in year 2, but hopefully there will be an independent evaluation of what we've done as well that can document, using the pillars as a direction.
I think just to add to what Betsy's just said there, it might, with the work that you're doing at the moment, it's getting that consistency in this country and then widening that net and that field to look at what's happening outside of this country. But I think at the moment, with the funding, the focus, the priorities, it is about getting that consistency across the UK as such, really.
Okay. How do you think that the research in the 6 pillars are tackling a culture of disbelief? I take it that means within the police force.
Right. Well, I guess the best way of saying of demonstrating that is demonstrating through the police officers who are doing work differently. It was a tough feedback in every force. I personally have done them all, and we've made officers cry. We've not made officers, but some officers have cried. Some officers have realized that actually what we're saying is what they realized but never named before, didn't have the courage to name it out loud in that kind of way because of the lack of support that they had. The work is become central to the work of Chief Constable Sarah Crew. She's leading the national approach to the policing of rape and sexual assault. This is as much her program as it is a piece of research. This is not just us. This is I'm only the foot soldier in many ways. Sarah is the leader, and we are getting some very interesting conversations going on with senior leaders, police leaders in this country, and the third sector in ways that, and I have to say, and the CPS. So their practice was recognized by what we fed back. Hostility, sometimes anger, sometimes defensiveness, but in many ways, recognition that this is what's happening. The other thing that's quite important for you to understand about this project is we have the ISRA service in the heart of this work. The victim feedback in every local area also confirmed what we found by our interviews and focus groups with police officers. So we do have a surround song that pretty much converged into this is the state of as is. Some not intentional sometimes, because you really want to make sure it's a good, right complaint. However, if we understand trauma, if we understand sexual assault, we really do need to approach victims in a very different kind of way. I don't know, Paula, if you want to say anything about that.
No, just a huge thank you for mentioning the ISVA's role within this research, because sometimes people see the academic level of engagement ignoring the voices of the victims and survivors. And like you said, it almost comes around full circle when it's echoed around what is actually happening as opposed to what you're suggesting is happening. It really feeds into that. And also that when it comes to any kind of research or piece of work, which is as important as this piece of work is, it's recognising the role of the third sector, because they have the ears and the voices of those who can't speak up to really help inform what's actually happening, and possibly also what could happen, what good looks like, and hopefully that will feed into the rest of your work.
Yeah, so when we started in the initial project, we brought the ISVA service in immediately. They were at the core of the inquiry in terms of, again, pillar 3. It's very much through the voice of the victim. We have victims forums, we have voice of the victim, we have collaboration with ISVAs. I'll just use an example of, again, Avon in Somerset. The ISVA service was not working well with the police in January of 2021. They're working really well with them now. ISVAs have passes to get in and out of the police station. They're being integrated into the care and concern about victims and discussions about investigations. They are part of the NFA panels. Again, part of a key, one of our suggestions is that victim's voice is represented at NFA panels, which are happening across many jurisdictions.
Just before we move on to the next question, can I just ask a follow-up question on that? Because Polly, when we talk about hostility and we talk about that reticence, I mean, bearing in mind the kind of work that you're involved in, does that come to light in relation to the officers and also the victims who've got that disbelief in how they're being treated?
I think now more than ever we're seeing such a lack of trust in policing on not just a operational level, but a cultural level as society, as women, as a whole range of collectives of identities, that it makes it even harder. I mean, part of our role through the third sector is to encourage engagement, to report to policing. But when we're getting reports back saying there's no point, or I tried and this is the negative impact it's had on me, and therefore it affects the rest of their survival journey. Absolutely, I'm seeing that there is that. But it's not just around the victim or the survivor, it's about their children, their families, their loved ones, their workplace. And so it creates more of for us to look at it, a more holistic response to hostility or distrust in police, because it's not just centred in one person, it's the ripple effect that has. And I think work like this operation really helps to shape the wider picture, the bigger picture that exists, in order to make the right changes that not only benefit the victim or the survivor, but ideally prevent this from happening in the first place. I also think there is a correlation, and as I was listening to you both with a lot of interest, was the overlap that the outcomes of your findings so far has on Black and minoritized victims and survivors, and particularly looking at issues around harmful practices, where again very similar outcomes are being demonstrated within your findings within our sector, and what more can be learned through policing and that collaborative approach to make sure all victims and survivors of all forms of abuse are afforded the same protection. So thanks.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the novel part of this work, is that actually at the heart of the collaboration is that conversation, and it has to be local. It has to be with victims representatives who are part of the solutions to, how do, and sometimes you can have those conversations without referring to particular cases, but you need to learn about and think about how we do an investigation that enables safeguarding as well as a challenge to the offender. And I think those things were never done together very well.
Just to, I suppose, add in terms of the culture of disbelief, one of the reasons why we realised that the training and learning programmes weren't adequate was because that culture of disbelief in some cases was not being addressed, or even was being supported by some of that learning delivery. So the rewriting of that programme and subsequent programmes is absolutely at the heart of it, tackling that issue head on. It's seen as absolutely crucial.
There's an interesting question, especially having the word disbelief in there, because that straight away gets that dialogue.
So the next couple of questions are going to be about the role of the police, and this question dovetails quite nicely with what you were just saying. Have we gone far enough in describing the role of the police in public protection? Are they enforcers, identifiers of risk, or supporters of the vulnerable? What is the public expectation?
It's all of the above, and more, because the other part of that is to be there in an emergency when you need them. So that's, again, one of the key predictors, or one of the constituent parts of trust and confidence is, do you trust them to be there when you need them? Because, as I said before, we want police. We need police, but we want good police. And so about 25 years ago, when I joined, 20 years ago, when I joined the Cabinet Office, one of the things I did was write the victim satisfaction survey 20 years ago, when one looked at how police officers respond to victims. Now, the thing about policing is that in its abstract, people were far more confident if they never had contact with a police officer than when they did. And that was an odd reversal of many other public services. The only one that continues to maintain that reversal is the trains. But even the NHS service, quite frankly, people have a view of it, but when they have contact with it, when they get good service, and when they actually say, oh my God, the NHS was there when I needed them. So contact with the NHS, your confidence went up. When you thought about it in the abstract, it was much more affected by the kind of political ethos that exists. But that was not true for policing. Policing's always been a conundrum for that reason, but it's still that way. Victims have less trust and confidence when they have contact with police, when they have no contact with police. Now, the goal of this project is to reverse that.
One of the points you also need to be aware of is the fact that police the gaps where other services have had to withdraw because of funding, because of changes in their working styles. It's the police officers who step into that gap with, for example, mental health. Police officers aren't trained mental health practitioners. They can deal with that moment of crisis, but they can't deal with anything more. But they've been expected to step into that gap more and more. And that's where that rub comes with, are you the enforcer? Are you the almost the social worker? And it is trying to get that balance right so that the service to the public is given, but not at the cost of the police officer's well-being as well, because how much can a police officer do the job of a police officer and a social worker and a mental health worker and a child protection officer? Because that's a big ask. And also the link between the third sector, the refugees, the volunteers, other people who do step in to assist and support. But that's a big ask from any police officer, for any individual, to try and deal with all of those different aspects of policing.
I think that really goes back to the question, what is the role of policing? It can't be all things police. But I'd actually like to, that narrative is, as much as we have the expectations of the role of the police, it's not just the police that can end rape. Communities of individual an active bystander and actually taking action when you see something and call it out as not being right. If we only focus on the role of the police as one part of the criminal justice system, as one part, whether we see them as enforcers or whether we see them as protectors, everyone's view of the police would depend on what it is that the point of intervention that they need them for. But actually we should be looking out within our schools, within our health systems, within our politicians and local authorities, in our community groups, to all work as as being allies of the police, rather than viewing it as a them and us and only singling them out. And I mean, I know how easy it is, and I'm a critical friend of the police, to say when something goes wrong, it's the police's fault. But whenever you point a finger at the police, chances are there's about 5 or 6 other services that could have prevented or supported a different outcome. So again, I think defining the role of police is really important, because it's changing, ever changing, and particularly during the pandemic, we saw how much more, like Palm said, of the different roles that they've taken on board. But it's not just the police's role that we need to identify, I think.
Yeah, so I'll just come back to the project, because what we're doing is actually the core of the policing task, and that is to investigate a crime that has been reported to them, a serious crime that has been reported to them, that has consequences across the board for society. Now, that's a core part of policing. So this project is at the core of policing. It is not. Yes, there are tangential issues that will, tangential and core in issues that will dovetail things like mental health, learning and disabled, minoritized, women's issues that are culturally based. These are all kinds, those kinds of things will exist. They're all there. But at this point, suggesting that officers need to be experts in all of that, because there are people out there that can help you with that. What we're suggesting is, I want officers to bring to the table an expertise that nobody else has, and that is how to investigate a rape and sexual assault. And I'm not being insulting by saying that. I think it needs to be redefined, and the way it's being redefined is that we're using the raped and sexually reform that approach. That's what this project's about, and that makes it different. It's not about new legislation. It's not about other kinds of things. It's about, this is the core. We are now integrating a knowledge base that hasn't been integrated into the way police do their work. That's what's different about this project, and it's done in a collaborative way, because I can tell you, we do have very good practitioners who get it. Their light bulb goes on bongo, and they are gone like a shot. They get it. Suddenly they have a language or an approach or a systematic way of going about things, and oh my goodness, the results are just, for me, I've never been involved in a project that has the power of this one. And that's a lot to say after my experience. This one's amazing. But it will be by resistance or lack of resourcing, or the ability to move as fast as we really need policing to move. I think we can move fast, actually. I think we've got the knowledge base, we've got the people, we've got a really, really strong third sector. Let's just do it. But there is, a lot of clunkiness and bumpiness being caused by other parts of the world at the moment. So my eyes are on this prize, basically, and I'm actually quite optimistic. I do think this project will have a really profound impact.
Next question is a little more specific around the role of the police, and something you just touched on there in terms of cultural differences. And that is, are the police doing enough to build a better understanding of different cultures and a reluctance to approach the police in these cases? Do the police have the cultural competence to address this area?
Should we give that on to Polly?
Well, I was actually going to ask if that fell within the learning and development of the piece of work that you did, because again, it's an area that arises quite often around, do you have to identities as a victim or a survivor in order to relate to their experiences, and having that cultural understanding. Yes, it's so important, but it's also something that can be taught. We work with level of knowledge and intelligence they have, not just on actions that they take, is really good, and it means that that can then be transferred to somebody else. So I certainly think that more still needs to be done to understand the nuances of the different cultural aspects of different types of harms that could happen. But actually, it's not the culture that causes people harm, it's the individuals. And we have to recognise, even this morning discussing this with my advert, even if somebody comes from the same background or ethnicity, doesn't mean they come from the same culture. And so even the word culture needs to sort of be defined a bit more. We're not all homogenous people. We have different identities, and particularly when it comes to honour-based abuse, what's acceptable in one community might be very different in another community. So again, as Betty said, we're not expecting police to become, super safeguarders around, knowledgeable about all things, but having access to those specialist services would certainly be a good step. And actually having those specialist teams, those dedicated specialist teams within police forces around DA, around harmful practices and RASAC are really, really crucial in order to ensure that that knowledge is retained and shared internally as well. Otherwise, you're going to, as soon as people leave, you're going to lose that intelligence, that knowledge base. And we've seen over the years the numbers of police leaving, particularly currently through retirement, etc., that we need to have those specialist areas and those specialist teams embedded within those forces and actually invested in, because again, we don't want to lose that knowledge that they have.
I mean, I would even take it further. I think it's really important to understand that this is also not only a collaboration between academics and the police, but all the local area as well, and the local third sector. What has not been especially revered, and I'm going to say this as someone who has spent 15 years inside policing, is the kind of knowledge base of somebody who didn't have PIPs, and to really to begin to respect the kinds of insight that your third sector has that you can use. I mean, call a friend, call a buddy, find out that you don't have, again, all of this can be done on confidential basis. It doesn't have to talk about a particular case, but you can say, I have somebody who, whatever, is Filipino and is a nurse at the Marsden Hospital and was this, and she's reluctant about this, and these are the kinds of issues that we need to do. There are people that you can talk to who are part of the Filipino community who might be able to give you some insight about the context within which she lives in London and the kinds of worlds that they live in. So it isn't about making every officer an expert in everything, because that's what happened. There was this sense that you have to go off and take a course in this and a course in that, and a course in this and a course in that, without the basics. And what we're doing now is we're going back to basics, saying get the basics right, but actually those basics can really be enhanced by an understanding of some of the narratives around offending. Actually, that's our key, is you need to know something about the way sexual offenders work. And if 25% of your named offenders happen to be the named before, hello, doesn't that tell you something about the fact that these guys have done it before and they've done it again? And strangely enough, sometimes more than one woman tells you that. Hello, again. How many times do you need to be told? Because one report means that if somebody intentionally is sexually assaulting, they've done it already. And a lot of times, as we're learning, they've also done it at home.
Okay, so one it should be a short answer, although I'm putting myself on the line there. And then 2 questions which I would class as broader, which might be conversation pieces. So the first, the quicker question is, how well connected are the CPS with the review?
CPS have a component of what's called Operation Soteria, and they are running a whole series of activities alongside of the activities of the police. Those are all available on the Joint National Action Plan as well as on CPS website. We will be doing more joint work with them. There has been an academic who has just been appointed by the CPS, so watch this space is what I'll say.
Can I suppose to add to that, so the way that we've been working nationally so far initially is with five police forces. That's now been expanded to an additional 14, and the CPS are working in the aligned CPS areas with us. So as well as there being some national alignment, as Betsy said, which will increase, there is local alignment. So in each of those forces working to drive change at a local level, they are working with their local CPS. I think the other key bit of alignment as we look forward into next year is that we are going to be using all of the evidence base and the work that we've done to inform the development of a RASO national operating model, which will be revealed, or certainly in first draft form in June next year. And the CPS are also developing a national operating model, which we hope and we
expect to be aligned.
We expect to be aligned, yes. So we'll be working with them to enable that alignment. But there's quite a long way to go before we get to that point. But yes, some close working and a real opportunity here to develop those 2 aligned operating models.
Before we go on to the next question, can I just make it clear to everyone who's listening, don't worry about the timings, because we will get a couple more questions in tonight, but any questions that aren't answered, we will circulate those to the panel members here, and we will get written answers published on the website. So don't worry if we do run out of time and your question isn't answered, it will be answered.
So the first of the broader questions, and I'm paraphrasing a little because it's been asked in a couple of different ways, but it kind of fed into something that was being discussed earlier, was what is being done, if anything, to review the burden of proof for rape? And if anything is being done, what are the risks of altering it?
So the legal advice is that I would assume that will be the conversation with the academic now hired by the CPS, and we've also brought on a lawyer whose expertise is in coercive control, and she will be helping develop the kind of guidance around burden of proof, particularly for coercive control cases. So that third overlap will be included in that. So the answer is tangentially yes, if indeed it means that the investigative narratives are much stronger than they were before, and that at the very least, what we're suggesting is the statements that of the summary of the offense start with the offender and not the victim. I'll just float that one in so the burden of proof is, yes, there is a burden of proof, but part of the proof which has been overlooked is understanding grooming, exploitation, abuse of authority. I could go on. So those elements, rape is not just about who put what where. It's about the context. It's about whether or not consent could take place and did take place. That's the burden of proof.
Okay, thank you. And this might be a good one, the last question, I don't know how we feel about that, but what are the key enablers to change, which is quite a broad question.
Yeah, who wants to do that?
I can start it off. I can start it off because this is about the general police reform, and if you don't admit you have an issue and you've got a problem, or the outcomes are not where they should be or you wish them to be, you've got to admit you've got a problem, and then from that you can identify a solution. But if you're going around saying, yep, rape's good, sexual offences, everything's been dealt with properly, it's been investigated, we've got enough officers, and the outcomes are great, then you are never going to have that change. There's no impetus for that change. There's no catalyst. And I talked about a catalyst earlier, and that's why the College of Policing and the National Police Chiefs Council have issued this new report, is because there were a number of catalysts. There were a number of women that were attacked, they were murdered, they were killed, and that was a catalyst for change and the demand for change. So normally something happened, and that's when people start looking at, well, what are the issues and how do we actually solve them? But unless you get that that push behind them, and it does go back to performance measurements. If you don't have performance measurements, then people are not going to invest. And one of the things that really irritates me is the amount of funding that goes into other departments, and yet there are a huge number of women who die from violence against women and girls, or who are the subject of rape and serious sexual offences. But the amount of money doesn't correlate when you look at the damage done to society and to people within that society. So that's just my way of trying to explain why we need to change, but how we need to go about to get that change.
I think that accepting there is a problem. The denial of understanding that there is a problem, whether it's in policing, which is the priority here right now, will then lead to change, will then lead to the recommendations through the work that's been done so far to make a difference. It's not going to happen overnight, but the first thing, and we've got it wrong. I think that would also feed into increasing trust in police, but it's not enough just to say we've got things wrong. We can see what's been going wrong. We can see every day you turn on the news or you hear of yet another woman murdered or killed as a next. So it's that strong it through the accountability to say we acknowledge that it's not always working and we've got things wrong up until now. Acknowledging this, we say that do exist. It doesn't make it go away, but just having the confidence of the leadership to say we recognise things are wrong, things aren't working, and this is what we're going to do, and you can hold me accountable to make sure that we affect that change. I think
we've seen a real step change, I suppose, in this program. What feels like a real step change is that the doors have been opened, certainly to those 5 police forces initially. Betsy potentially has even underplayed the amount of, a huge amount of research took place in each of those forces, between 40 and 50 researchers in each force. Stones were turned over, absolutely extensive, in-depth research was conducted, and that sees a step change, and that, she said, that there's an acknowledgement there, and there has been an acknowledgement there, not as publicly as we would have liked just yet, of the change that's needed. We're also seeing, through the expansion into 14 additional forces, some of those forces coming to us saying, we absolutely know we need to change, we need to be part of this programme. Other forces, I think, maybe as Palm caricatured a little bit, still maybe thinking actually they're doing most of what's needed and they're not really sure how they need to improve. One of the key things with this programme is to shine that light, and is to almost put forces in that uncomfortable position of the recognition that they need to change. That understanding of or an acceptance of current lack of capability and so on, but also to provide that opportunity and a way forward. So that does feel like a shift, but there's a very long way to go.
Yeah, and I'll just add 2 obstacles. Not that there are others. One is the starting point is really low. We have a long way to go. We don't actually know what good looks like. So if indeed we're finding that appallingly. 1.3, 1.6%. I'll repeat that. 1.3 to 1.6% of all reports are being charged. Then we have a long way to go, and we need to have some patience about that. But we also need to see progress, and I think that's one of the difficulties. Is this is not like we have a bunch of levers that we pull them and they all pull in the same way together. Instantly, it's going to make a difference. This is still going to be slower than I would want to, but I can tell you I've been heartened by what I've seen so far. The other obstacle is just the day-to-day demand. I mean, we're trying to do this in the context of doing your day job. Now that's really difficult. It's really difficult for officers who feel already an onslaught and exhaustion. So trying to build in a little breathing space, a kind of a boost of self-confidence by learning something new. I mean, that's one of the, why would you have 1,000 people listening to Patrick Tidmarsh at 8:30 in the morning? Because they wanted to learn. Absolutely, officers want to learn. They want to learn something that's going to help them. And I think that it's that kind of, I know that there's hunger out there for doing something differently. And I would really like to be able to run as fast as we possibly can to keep up with that. And that's going to be a challenge. Remember, there's only a whole handful of us. We're really trying to do a massive piece of work. And the amazing thing for me is we're actually doing it. So that's not an obstacle, that's an enabler. But the enabler also means that has a limitation as well. And so that's why we're asking police forces to be the enablers. Step up. You know, really, you're going to have to stop what you're doing and do it differently tomorrow. You know, the day that they decided not to drive on the, I don't know what it was, right or left-hand side in Belgium, what they did on Sunday night, midnight, boom, stop the cars, boom, drive on the other side of the road. Sometimes it has to happen like that.
I think Betsy makes a really interesting point, not just about Belgium, but also about the officers who are logging on at 8:30 for learning and development. And again, it could potentially be part of the well-being of officers and the burnout, because how much can officers themselves do themselves? So there has to be a change in focus. There has to be more investment in learning and development in the workplace, so that they can take those changes forward and and identify those solutions, because they're willing to put in the time, but it's just, have they got the time then to implement those changes and that learning that they're picking up? So there's quite, that's a big question. There's a huge question with the enablers and the and the inhibitors as well.
Okay, that covers the majority of the questions, or derivatives of most of the questions that I've put together. As we said earlier, if your question wasn't answered, we will make attempts to answer it after this meeting.
Okay.
Over to you, Rod.
Yeah, no, I'd like to sort of just
turn the camera around.
Well, no, I was going to ask a question actually.
Oh,
I'm just going to use my prerogative being in the room. One of the things that's has always worried me about domestic abuse and violence against women and girls and these serious offences, we're talking about a category of offences which are by far the biggest killer of people in terms of crime, way off the scale. We're talking about a crime that all police officers talk about rape as the most serious crime in the world. How do we get to a position where we can actually live with the level of outcome that we have lived with for the last 10 years? What's happened? What do you think, from what you've looked at, has led us to be in a place where policing had to be sort of forced to look at this rather than it emerged from within them?
How much time do you have?
10 minutes.
Yeah, you got 13 minutes.
Okay, I'll just, yeah, well, there's a couple, I mean, there is a whole history to whether or not the kind of approach that feminist scholars have documented for decades have been accepted. So you can go back to the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, and you realize that that stuff that were just considered a fringe element. In many ways, what we're actually talking about is stuff that's been documented by health officials, and it's all, I mean, it is now an accepted part that is, you know, the biggest detriment to women's health is violence. So that's been accepted. I think in terms of policing's taken its eyes off some outcomes. It measured itself and it got, and I'll use the word deflected, which is not the right word when it comes to violence, other kinds of violence, and between men, for example, and so issues around knife crime and gangs and all that kind of stuff sort of dwarfed. It's actually quite a small proportion of reports to the police, but that small proportion, and what we're learning is that just there's so many of these cases are so complex, they just add it to a very large pile of someone, many austerity cut, any kind of specialized rape units. So it just sort of, the more complex ended up to the bottom, and then time ran out, victims said I'd have enough, they just stopped engaging, and you just NFA it. With the greatest respect, that's one of the things that happened, just it went off the burn. I mean, I started this initial work in 2005 in the Met, reported back to management board. It was a very tense report, but basically it's not different in terms of the kinds of things that we've been talking about. So it's taken 17 years to now come back on the table. That's a long time. And we also have senior leaders that are willing to challenge their own behavior. And you know, if Sarah Crew hadn't invited us in to say, start with my force first, we wouldn't have the traction that we've got now.
Can I just add to that? We're all very well aware that the laws of this country, or many countries, are made by men, and the voices of women are often the secondary, if ever, heard around that. So we were having a conversation earlier, if the number of cases of violence against men by women were in contrast to where we are today, do we really think we have this problem? And again, I think it is that exclusion, and thankfully now the inclusion of women's voices and the feminist academics and research and everything else that's been really laid out has added to these conversations. But also, as Palm highlighted, you know, the recent high profile cases, they're not going to stop, they're not going to go away. We're going to see this happening more and more, and it's that shock factor perhaps that the prevalence of this is more visible now than it has been in the past, that hopefully will allow for those enablers of change to happen and address it. But as with cultural practices, they're written by men to benefit men. The laws, we talked earlier about Peelian principles, were developed by men to protect the rich. So we need to change that narrative right now by including the voices and actually just seeing what's in front of us every day, male violence against women and girls, and do something about it.
And just to add to that, I think it is important that one of the changes that I've noticed is that society, police officers, anybody in power, they're more willing to listen to the voices of community representatives, the charities, whereas I don't think I can remember a time where the charities or the third sector were included in that decision making as much as they are now. And I think that has made a positive change, but that's also created that impetus for that demand for change, whereas before that those voices were, you know, they're still not as loud as they could be, but they are beginning to be heard, and I think that is making a positive difference as well.
I think this is not actually answering your question, Rob, but really continuing to sort of think about why things are different now. I think one of the things that I can see is that it almost feels finally there are more women, or enough women, in positions of decision-making power to enable things to happen, to encourage the early thoughts of a project like this to be developed, to say, why don't you take this project nationally rather than just doing it locally? Why don't you look, as you know, what, you know, and I suppose, and maybe for women to have the confidence to say, we're going to go and ask for this funding, you know, and other women to say, well, actually, I support that. And so it means for me, it feels a sort of like a critical point has been reached. Obviously, as we also know, that those critical points are simply lines in the sand, and if we don't keep pushing them forward and drawing them back in, they disappear almost overnight. So there's no complacency at all, but it does feel, you know, I suppose those things, as well as Palm says, hearing the voices from the third sector, which often are female voices, not always, but certainly community voices, and obviously the dreadful events that we talked about, which in some ways precipitated the you know, the drive for delivering and funding a piece of work like this. That's one of the things that feels very different to me now.
And to round it off and bring it back to our theme, which is confidence and trust, there is a lowering of confidence and trust in democracy right now, and I don't want to see that. I do not want to see that. And police is such a critical part of the foundation of democracy that we really do, I feel, just a strong obligation to do everything I can to make it better, and for us to take seriously the learning that we know. We know a lot about how to gain trust and confidence. We actually do know how to do that. We just need to do it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions, and thank you for the questions. I think there are a few that have been consolidated so that we had time to answer as much as we could today. We will separate those questions back up, and then we will put a précis of what's happened today and answer those questions as well. So thank you all very, very much for your time. Can we just put the slide on for the email address for the good practice to be shared, please? So I'm just going to draw your attention one more time to the email address of, if you wish to contribute any good practice or ideas. And also, if you have a question that you think of after this panel has finished, and you think I would like to ask that, especially as we've got such a renowned panel here, then please do send those through, and we can make sure that we'll circulate those to the panelists. So
we can send to everybody who's logged on the details.
Okay, perfect.
We'll do that straight away afterwards.
All right, thank you. Is there anything else?
Anything else, Rod?
No, I just wanted to say thank you.
Do you want to turn the camera around?
So yeah, I wanted to say a big thank you to everybody for this afternoon. But I think the bit for me was when you were talking, was thinking about the connection between this and other elements of policing at the moment. And for many years we seem to have thought about crime against women as something separate as what's happening in society. And I think I'm wondering how much of what's happened is because of social networking, more things being put out with less control over the messaging in the media than may have happened in the past, because of all the networks of communication that go on, whether things have been loosened up a little bit. But I'm also thinking that the whole modern approach to demonstration and people out what are the key issues for them have changed dramatically in the past few years, and that maybe society is in a different place to where it's been in the past. So I'm really hoping that what we've had a conversation about today will feed into the conversation around fraud and cybercrime, because however much we think about fraud and cybercrime as crimes happening over there, the majority of fraud and cybercrime is happening towards women as well, strangely as it
And in the home.
What and in the home. And also massive changes in the way that we think about public demonstration. And there was one of the things I saw in the chat bar was talking about disruption officers and engagement officers, and thinking about when we look at public order policing, the big changes we've had recently in public order policing have been about bringing in engagement officers, thinking about how those So there's a massive possibility for us to take things from different areas and learn from them, and to think about the learning and development model you're putting forward as well as the specifics of things. So thank you very much for that for today, and I hope we're going to see you all at the actual conference in September when we might have some things to pull together.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.